Passover and the IRS. It's the tax story we look at this week on Point of View. Hello, I'm Judy Jarvis. Do we like the government we're buying with our taxes? Will our taxes, in particular our state taxes, go up next year? We'll hear from two lobbyists, Barbara Anderson of the Citizens for Limited Taxation and Jim Braude of the Tax Equity Alliance of Massachusetts. Later in the program, we'll get the media angle on the Massachusetts fiscal crisis from Mark Jerkowitz, who writes the Don't Quote Me column for the Boston Phoenix. First, some background. There is waste, there is fraud, there is corruption in state government. The questions are, how much? And will the efforts to correct such abuses solve the fiscal problems Massachusetts is going through? Some people cannot afford to pay more taxes and don't understand why they should. How to find the truth is another question, as Massachusetts faces what some say is a 2-year deficit of $2.5 billion. Do we get the government we pay for? Are all of us taxed fairly? These questions will not go away, especially without long-lasting solutions to the current fiscal and political mess on Beacon Hill. Now, Barbara Anderson, who is perhaps the nation's and certainly the Commonwealth's busiest unelected anti-tax crusader. She was once Secretary for Citizens for Limited Taxation and is now its chief spokesman. Jim Braude, once a legal services lawyer and union leader, is now engaged full-time in an effort to counter Barbara's November 1990 referendum question that would roll back fees and taxes with his referendum question to raise and target taxes. And if people understand what the two of you are up to, they're doing pretty well. Let me start with you, Ms. Anderson. Will taxes go up this year or next?
Will they? Actually, the one thing that surprised me is how long the House members are holding out on this. I thought they'd weaken, back in February or March. So
not with you on the radio every week screaming and yelling about this.
Well, not with their constituents, making it very clear how they feel about this, and not with their own pledges that they will not raise taxes until they've gone through another round of spending cuts.
How much has been cut?
I don't know.
Let me stop you in the middle. How much has been cut since all of this started 2 years ago?
Well, the budget they're talking about right now, the budget that they're about to start debating, is going to be a major increase, of course, over this year's. This year's will be a $457 million increase over last year's. What they have cut, of course, is the rate of increase. The budget used to go up $1 billion a year, and now that simply can't be afforded any longer. So they're talking about cuts in the growth, not in the actual bottom line budget.
Be part of this discussion
tonight, well, there are always two sets of facts when you two are here. But Barbara, your answer is you don't know. You're surprised taxes haven't gone up already, and you just can't predict.
Well, I mean, I think there's pretty much an assumption that they are going to vote for a tax package this summer. They have to be aware, though, that our initiative petition will repeal those taxes if the people vote for it. I think that's a major item in their consciousness as they're thinking about this. I think we still have a slight chance to avoid that tax increase.
Do you have any conscience, by the way, about your referendum question now that you see that it looks like the deficit by everybody's estimates is quite huge?
Well, that's the whole point of our ballot question. If it weren't for our ballot question, you'd see a $1 billion tax increase this year, followed by another $1 billion plus next year in tax increases, and then another $1 billion plus after that. There's no way to stop this except to use a ballot question to force them to take stock of their priorities and start to downsize government.
I'll let you follow up.
I don't know where to begin. No cuts.
Will taxes go up?
I think the answer is they better. They should have gone up a year ago. Barbara said that she thought they'd weaken earlier in the legislature. They did weaken earlier. That's why we haven't had a tax package. That's why we've got a $2.5 billion deficit, and that's why services are being dismantled all across Massachusetts.
So to you, weaken is not voting for taxes?
No, to me, weaken is not to tell the truth to your constituents. There are so many members of the legislature that have been preaching this painless tax-free road out of the fiscal wilderness, and it's like being snake oil salesmen. The deficit grows, services continue to be dismantled, some in small increments, some in large increments. Have they cut nothing? $600 million from Dukakis' budget request last year, another $490 million vetoed, another $100 million done in the late winter. The reality is, of course...
May I stop you for because that was the answer I thought that you were going to give. You acknowledge that those cuts have in fact been made.
But I'm making it clear, since people I've found don't really understand this. They think you take a $12 billion budget and suddenly it's a $10 billion budget. What was cut last year by Richie Volk and others was the governor's proposed increase of $1 billion. They only allowed an increase of $500 million, and that was vetoed. So the total increase of this year over last year, at least according to Chairman Volk at the hearing the other day, will be about $457 million.
But
Now
Judy,
you can continue.
the issue is not have they cut X dollars or Y dollars. The issue is, are they delivering the kind of quality and quantity of services the people of the state demand?
Ask Barbara that question.
Well, she's sitting here. What's the answer to the question? I don't think Barbara really cares very deeply about whether they do.
Jim,
Her
you
view
have
is
no way of knowing how I
finish
care,
the
what I
sentence.
care about. But
Fine.
stick
What I
with
want to
you
say,
know,
fine.
not with what I think.
What I know is that somebody who filed a ballot question when the deficit was $500 million and would cut $1 billion, the deficit has grown 4 times, and since you have no solution to the problem, you want to double the size of the problem. That's not somebody who cares very deeply about the kind of services that are delivered to families in Massachusetts.
I'm going to try to answer for you. You still think that there is enough real waste in the budget. Is that correct?
Oh, yes.
I assume that you both, in fact, you both don't seem to really want to raise taxes, and you both don't seem to really want to cut services.
If somebody had, Judy...
Is that true?
If somebody had a $2 billion solution, I can speak for me. If somebody had a $2 billion solution that was honest, that cut things without causing services that are important services to be dismantled, we'd be first in line there. But all you hear, Judy, are anecdotes, wonderful anecdotes that are elevated to an art form. The legislature took 15 weeks in the late fall to cut $100 million from the budget. At that electric pace, it would take us a decade to balance
Well,
this budget.
but on that you agree.
Of course, and the electric pace is a shame. At least they were moving in that direction. What we thought is if we continued to encourage them, they'd then take another step and do another $100 million, another $100 million. Instead, they went home for 3 months. This is the part that you get frustrated about because, yes, they can cut it. Will they? There doesn't seem to be the will, at least in the leadership, to follow through on suggestions made by rank-and-file members.
But the answer to my earlier question is that you have no regrets about your referendum question.
Oh, no, thank heavens the voters have something, some tool. Otherwise, we'd be here with $1 billion tax increase right now. Then they'd forget about the downsizing part of the formula and go home for the fall and campaign, and this would fester until next year, and we'd be hit with another $1 billion.
A tool is one thing, but what if it really happens? What if it really passes?
Well, it's like Proposition 2.5. It really happened. It really passed. The voters sent a clear message. We all worked together, and 10 years later, 2.5 at least is still working in the state. And
but now there's no state money to bail you out.
And that's exactly the point. The reason Prop 2.5 works, and I use the term advisedly, is because the state has provided this lifeline to cities and towns for almost a decade. State revenues are declining. Federal monies disappeared to a great degree under Ronald Reagan.
Disappeared. $1 billion here, $1 billion there.
Well, Ray, what's a couple of $billion?
$1 billion.
The bottom line
if
is...
you're going to be truthful, don't use the word disappeared. Federal revenues are coming in at a rate of increase each year, and
That
always
happens
have
not to
been.
be true.
That's not true.
$4.3 billion cut in the 80s under Ronald Reagan.
Well,
problem-
the facts are,
40%
the facts are
since
that there
Reagan.
has been a shift from
Yes.
federal responsibility
And it
to state
continues, Judy.
responsibility.
A few weeks ago, George Bush stood up and said he has the solution to the transportation problem. Do you remember what it was? Let the states pay for it. It's a terrific solution. The well is running dry.
Well, I've got a problem with both of you, which, let's take a break, actually, and we'll come back to that. We'll be right back.
Perception across the state, as any one of us, be a Republican or Democrat, talk to people in general, that the administration has not cut enough.
Okay, this is my problem with both of you. You want to cut taxes, you want to raise taxes, but you both want services to be pretty much the same. And you're both going this route of referendum government when we have our duly elected representatives. Why don't you just take all this time and energy and get new people in if you don't like the folks who are there?
I think that's been done. I mean, people run for office making certain promises which they probably think they can fulfill. They get in there and they hit that solid wall of resistance.
So get rid of them. I mean, they're up for re-election every 2 years.
I think there's going to be an element of that. I think a lot of them are going to be gone come November, but I think it's difficult to expect a state rep to go in there and deal with a professional bureaucracy and with a professional administration that is not cooperating.
So you want to impose upon them a mechanism,
Yes.
and yours, Jim, is a very complicated piece of legislation.
But the
that
core
would have.
theme is quite simple. It's relatively fair taxation that gives low and moderate income families a break for a change, and every single penny of that $400 million raised goes directly to services that
How do you
families
know
care
that?
about.
How can
Well,
you?
how do you ever know? It's a law. Can they violate the law?
No,
Of course they
that's
can
silly,
violate
though. I
the
mean,
law.
that's just such a phony way to deal with this. There's no such thing as earmarking. Jim's Jim's package says that the money is going to be earmarked for human services and infrastructure, and these are the things that already $12 billion is going toward, and within those categories you've got the waste and the inefficiency.
I mean, it seems to me you just both have different villains. I mean, your villains are the corporations. You want them to pay more.
No, not villains at all. Judy,
and your villains are the hacks. That even if you fired the entire state bureaucracy.
No, our
villains
are the caucus
just wait a
administration.
second. We lived through a year.
Oh, good. Now you're both mad at me.
We lived through
That's
almost $1 billion increase in taxes and fees last year, virtually all of which was visited on low and moderate income families. We don't see corporations as villains. We see them as people who should care just as deeply about the fact that 51% of the bridges are substandard, 9,000 kids are locked out of the higher education system, and maybe, oh my God, maybe they should contribute to the rescue of these services. If Barbara firmly believes...
Shouldn't everybody contribute fairly?
That's exactly our point. And the moment that happens, they'll no longer be villains. They'll be participating in an important activity, rescuing decent things that are
and we won't be living in America.
They're already participating in providing all the jobs that provide all the revenue for all state services. So if we simply increase the number of private sector bankruptcies, which were up 59% last year, I don't see how that's going to solve the problem. And I have no problem.
You think his question will cause bankruptcy?
No, his ballot question is talking about a, what, $400 million increase. That leaves us still $600 million short. Sooner or later, he's going to have to start looking at serious cuts in the government size, whether it's in the bureaucracy or if they don't do their job in services. So we essentially have the same problem.
Well, let me just say that Barbara is probably one of the best students of government in Massachusetts. If she believes that there's $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion, which is what we'd have to cut if her ballot question becomes law after this year's 2.3. If that list exists somewhere, I'd like to see it. We'll join in this notion that we can, in a painless way, streamline government.
And if I'm wrong,
Barbara, it's a phony notion. It's just a phony notion. Is there more waste and inefficiency in government to be ferreted out? Of course. But the problem is, as long as government bashing, really led by Barbara, becomes the only growth industry in Massachusetts, which is really what's happened in the last couple of years, we're never going to have a resolution to this problem.
And if I'm
People
wrong,
have got
Judy,
to stand up
if
and
I'm
honestly
wrong,
say we need money.
We're talking about a $3 billion tax increase over the next 3 years.
If you're wrong about what?
If I'm wrong about their being able to downsize government, and they can't do that, that $3 billion Jim is now talking about is a $3 billion tax increase which our economy cannot sustain.
Well, now
and
it's time for you not to put words in my mouth, Barbara.
Well, you're the one who's telling me that I can't find $3 billion worth of cuts.
I don't think you can find $3 million,
you've got to find $3 billion worth of tax increases, none of which are going to be fair and equitable on people who can afford to pay.
Is it true, though, that even if we fire the entire state bureaucracy of some 65,000 people, that we're only talking about less than $3 billion?
Well, that's their numbers. The state bureaucracy is much higher than that. But no, you're not talking about...
What is it, Barbara, if it's much higher than that, by the way?
If you're talking about
allegedly untrue. What is the state bureaucracy?
How many employees do you
The
think
last time we looked, it was 89,000 regular state employees plus about 25,000 in the 07 accounts.
The last time you looked
areas.
must have been 3 or 4 years ago.
We haven't seen any evidence.
Well, I don't want to play the numbers game. The point I was trying to make is that the payroll is only a piece.
Oh, yeah.
A small piece, not tiny.
The hacks is not my thing, okay? That's Howie's thing. My thing is the restructuring and reorganizing of the way government works. Our state spending went up $1 billion in just 1 year during that Massachusetts miracle. To cut $1 billion means that one of those years would have been level funded. So while it sounds like a lot of money, in fact, our petition, which cost, say, $350 million the first year, according to the Mass Taxpayers Foundation, is 3% of the existing state budget. That's all.
I'd like to suggest that you're both trying to take the easy way out with this petition.
What's the hard way out?
Hard way out is to make the people that we pay to do those jobs do those
Let me tell you
jobs.
something,
Petitions
Judy.
do that. Petitions put that pressure on them.
I hate to agree, but it's tax day, so we can be wild and crazy. I tend to agree with Barbara. The reality is, my organization doesn't like resolving fiscal issues on the ballot. Our bumper sticker, and we reformed, said good tax policy doesn't fit on bumper stickers. We're doing it because the legislature has indicated either an inability or unwillingness to resolve this problem. You have two choices. Sit back and allow them to fiddle while Massachusetts burns, or go directly to the people. On November 6th, they're going to have a choice between two different views of the future. I think that's going to settle this issue once and for all.
We never do it either till we have to, and we've tried lobbying. We tried to restrain their spending over the last 6 years, warning that this was going to happen. Finally, they insisted on spending the money anyhow, so now we have to have a petition drive. There's no other choice.
Pollster John Gorman found that people are willing to pay. This is an old story and yet a new story, too. People are willing to pay for services. They're willing to pay even more taxes if they think their money is going to the right place. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Unqualifiedly, yes.
And really the problem is their perception of this political paralysis.
I think that's accurate. And if there were not that political paralysis, we probably wouldn't be sitting here talking about it.
They also, I don't know if people think this, George Kavarian said last week that he thinks it's the governor's fault. Is that true or just a good excuse?
I think that little blip that came out of George Kavarian's mouth was very unfortunate. Anybody can blame this problem on anybody else. So the reason the legislators choose to talk about the alleged sins of Mike Dukakis or somebody else is because they don't have the courage to stand up and do the correct and honest thing.
So what he told the Globe you think was a good excuse, not the truth?
No, I think, he's repeating. No, I don't mean to criticize Kavarian. I think Kavarian was reflecting what he hears from the members. I'm suggesting that
let me ask you, do you think it's the governor's fault?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely. The fish rots from the head.
I've heard that before somewhere.
Yes, right. Mike Dukakis said it.
Yes, indeed.
And he's right.
You're blaming this whole mess on Mike
of course, the legislature has to take responsibility for this. They were all playing presidential politics, not all of them, but most of the Democrats were during the presidential campaign and not paying attention to the Commonwealth. But you have to have leadership from the top, someone who people trust is sitting in that top position.
Barbara,
nobody here trusts that person in the top position.
That's why, as we sit here tonight, 26 states have a deficit. 31 states have raised taxes, and unless you know what I don't know, that Mike Dukakis has been sneaking around in the middle of the night being governor of all these other states, it's a national problem that is infecting everybody's
Those governors are in trouble, too. Unfortunately, people in those states don't have an initiative petition process, and their governors, I understand, are not running for re-election either.
Many states do.
Yeah, they made the same mistake that we did. They spent too much in those good years.
You've been criticized, Barbara, for this government bashing that Jim mentioned. Are you worried at all that people are not focusing on the real problems and are sort of having fun just finding villains in the story?
Actually, I don't think what I do is government bashing. I do Dukakis bashing. I admit that. But we're the ones who are saying the government can work. The system can work. They can find that place to downsize if we keep the pressure on. If we didn't believe in government, we'd simply have to give up because obviously you can't cut $1 billion with people who are totally incompetent. We think they're competent to do it if we keep the pressure on.
Downsizing, by the way, is the classic euphemism in the year of the euphemisms.
It's the exact description of what it is.
Barbara's continued to say $1 billion. What she ignores is we have a $2 billion problem. She wants to add another $1 billion to that. It's a $3 billion hole that she's going to create.
Your position is that
$1 billion a year.
Your position, Jim, is that what Barbara Anderson's group wants to do would dismantle services would be a disaster, which is what
I think a disaster is a nice way
to
describe what she wants to do on November 6th, yes.
And yet you're talking about a $12 billion budget. $12 billion
Barbara, the issue is not is it $12 billion,
$6
billion, $3 billion?
At the same time you're talking $12
Okay, we only have a couple of minutes left.
Yes.
One question for Jim, and Jim, one question for Barbara. Get him.
It's a tough one,
You have
Barbara.
them
I'm ready
clean,
for
you
you.
have them open.
Times are running.
Well, okay, you keep talking about fair and equitable taxes. You're just talking now about the need for $3 billion more in spending. Which $3 billion worth of taxes do you think are fair and equitable?
It's a great question, other than the fact that I don't think we need $3 billion in taxes.
Well,
in fact, no, I didn't, Barbara. What we have said all along...
Well, even if it were less, why don't you answer a question?
I think the answer is follow the example on our ballot question, which treats low and moderate income families fairly. It basically says things like a capital gains tax break where $300 or $400 million accrues to the wealthiest families and services are disappearing from everybody else. That's the kind of direction.
Even cover this
Yeah, that's one tax.
Where's the rest of the
increased capital gains?
Absolutely. And we can do something else we do on our ballot question, which doesn't raise the sales tax rate, but expands it to cover a whole host of business services that, for once again, will give those low and moderate income families a break.
And a third, fair and equitable
But
tax.
that's still within $400 million.
Ultimately, and the Constitution's got to be changed, the only solution to this in the long term is a graduated income tax like virtually every state has, like the federal government has. That's on the way.
Now you've got a question for Barbara.
Where'd you get that necklace, Barbara? No, I'm sorry, I don't mean that question. Barbara, could you list for us even $1 billion, even $500 million of things you would cut from this budget with some specificity for a change so that people out front can see, is there
you're
really...
taking up more time for the question. You got the question.
What's the answer?
Okay, well, I have time to do $500 million worth of cuts then?
Start.
Okay, now, the first thing I think you have to do is what the Globe recommended. If I hate to...
I can't believe it.
I know, but they had a really interesting idea in an editorial. They said that you would have to list the essential things, the things you have to do. Mostly federal mandates. You have no choice about that. Debt service, pension funds, things that are essential. Okay, but Medicaid. And then on the other side, you put the things you do which are not necessarily essential, and you start trading off.
Did you hear the answer to my question?
Yeah, well, you have to get into this. So, say the first one, my first $400,000 would say the Lieutenant Governor's office.
Get rid of that.
Money. Well, there's no reason for that.
Okay.
That $400,000.
That's a good
that
start.
$400,000 could be sent back to, say, the Association for the Blind for the Talking Book
Well,
program.
let's not even do that. So
you
get rid of the Lieutenant Governor's office. Number two.
But you have to do it as a trade-off.
Okay, number two.
Then you go in and you start dealing with step increases. If you're going to talk about pay raises, you have to tie the step increases in state salaries in with performance schedules.
State workers have gone a year without a pay increase, Barbara.
So
Are you going to cut them worse?
cut state employees'
But
salaries.
we're talking about long-term changes here.
And number three?
Number three, well, one thing you certainly are not going to do is you're not going to start building the Mount Greylock Reservation out there, and you're not going to start doing the museum, the North Adams Museum, because the debt service on that could easily be used for services for the mentally retarded and the 2022 program.
I thank you both very much, and we'll be back in a moment with Mark Jerkowitz.